Well, good evening, FBN. So good to be here with you as we jump into Proverbs chapter 5. I realize I think I start every midweek Bible study that way, and so I don't really have a better way to do it. It still feels weird talking to a video screen or whatever, but I'm praying that you guys are tuning in and finding value in these midweek Bible studies. We're going to start in prayer here in a minute, but I just want to remind you all of where we are, just the context of where we're at in Proverbs chapter 5, which is a chapter that is very heavily against just seduction, promiscuity, guarding ourselves from that, but also guarding against people who might draw us into that. And this week, starting in verse 15, which is where we're going to be at, we have some sensitive things. So I just wanted to give you a quick disclaimer before we go into it. If you have little ears around you as you're watching this video, there might be some things acknowledged and said about our current culture today, and some words used that I don't really know if you're ready for your kids to hear those or not. So that's your discretion. But if you are conscious of that, just so you know, that'll probably be on the table tonight. So, with that being said, use your discretion to, tune into this video safely. But can't say I didn't give you a heads up, okay? So I just wanted to give you that disclaimer before we get going. So why don't we get going? Let's start with a word of prayer, given the sensitive nature of our conversation. And then we'll jump into Proverbs chapter 5, starting in verse 15, okay? God, thanks so much for this time together. Grateful for each and every person who's tuning in, who is finding value in these midweek Bible studies, and who is trusting you still through the pandemic and through just the awkward season of ministry. They're just trusting you. They're staying fasted to your word. They're drawing their strength from you. They're seeking you. And I pray that tonight would just be another opportunity for them to draw closer and closer to you, that they would know more and more of Jesus. And as a result, they would share more and more of Jesus with others. God, use our discussion this evening for the furtherment of your gospel. In Jesus' precious name, we pray. Amen. Great. Well, Proverbs chapter 5, join us there. And I want to begin with just some general remarks regarding just our current culture. Now, I think, a Wednesday night Bible study like this, my guess is most of you tuning in are either my age or older, even significantly older, just based on the typical Wednesday night group that we have. And so I think it might be easy for us to kind of lose sensitivity to what people younger than us are going through. Okay, so just for an example, when I was in high school, I got my first cell phone, and it was a flip phone. And I remember I had like 200 texts a month, max, and we were paying pretty good money to get that, right? That was without data. There was no data. There wasn't really, I can't recall, but I don't even think there was like Wi-Fi necessarily. All of that stuff has happened in the last like 15 years. You know what I mean? I graduated in 2005. So for everybody after me, though, even the next kind of the high school crew, you know what I mean? People who would have went into high school after me, that's when it all really just started to kick in. And what we had was just this world of, not that it wasn't accessible before, but now it was just becoming increasingly accessible through smartphones and especially smartphones, but then Wi-Fi, just internet access everywhere, and just the digital age that we live in now. You've got to understand that our young people who are growing up in that have a world of promiscuity and seduction and sex and all of that stuff. They have a world of that at their fingertips. We all do now, but we also didn't have to deal with it necessarily in our formative years. But statistics say that they're kind of all over the place, but it's a very, very, I read one from fightthenewdrug.com. It's a non-religious, research-based website dedicated to, giving people the research of the risks of, pornography. It's a great resource. And they based on their resources and research, said that 93% of young men are exposed to pornography for their first time well before the age of 18. But by the age of 18, 93% of young men have been exposed to pornography. And I think for women, it was like, for young women, it was like from 60 to 70%. Okay. The vast majority of our youth and our young people today are growing up with the images of pornography instilled in them at young ages, as early as 3 to 6 years old. Many reports are 6 to 8 years old. I've heard that number a lot too. That our kids are growing up with this because it's becoming more and more normalized. It's becoming more and more accessible, right? And it's not an uncommon thing for any of us to see an 8-year-old walking around with a smartphone, and you just wonder, well, are there any parental supervisions going on here? Because if not, you will inevitably come across pornography, even on accident. Even if you're not looking for it, it will come across, That's the world that they're growing up in. And the result of that, I think, has just been this normalization of what, high schoolers now, just the whole Netflix and chill movement, you know what I mean? Just this casual sexual experience. It's becoming normalized. You hear from high schoolers now who they're sexually active and they had no idea that it was even bad or risky because it's becoming that normalized and that it's just becoming that accessible. And it's forming our young people. And it's tragic. It's tragic because, we know the risks, and many of them will know the risks later in life. But for now, because it's become such a prominent piece of culture and it's celebrated in, Hollywood and media, and it's all about self-gratification. That's just the world they grow up in. They don't know any different. And it's why we so desperately need pieces of wisdom, such as Proverbs chapter 5, for example, to come in and to speak truth into that experience and to redeem what is going to be so frequently and easily lost among our young people. Okay. Just the other day, actually, we were, our kids play outside at our house with tons of neighborhood kids. I mean, you can look outside and there might be 13 little kids just running around the house. And it's a pretty cool environment. And I think the oldest one of them is maybe 10 or 11. Like, they don't get super old, you know what I mean? But that's old enough, and certainly, our little girls don't have cell phones or anything like that yet. Our oldest is 7. So we're not too... Yeah, she's 7. We're not too concerned with getting them cell phones yet, but everybody around them has them, and they all play together. Everything's pretty good and it's pretty managed. But every once in a while we'll just be sitting on the front porch, and a couple of the little dudes don't know that we're out there, and they're just kind of hanging out with themselves. And they'll say, just the other day, this one little dude just said the most pornographic thing I've ever heard. Like, I've barely heard adults talk this way, let alone a 10-year-old kid talking to his 10-year-old friend, And they just said it while they were walking down the drive or the sidewalk. And I was just like, man, my daughters play with these kids, you know what I mean? So who knows what my kids are hearing and what my kids are taking in and haven't told me about yet. And so it's a sensitive world, and it's tough. But the reality is that it's getting harder and harder to shelter from it. You know what I mean? If 93% of kids in America are growing up already having some pornographic experience by the time they're 18, it's getting almost impossible to shelter our kids from it. But listen, I think one of the encouragements from our scriptures tonight is that we don't focus so much on sheltering, but teaching and equipping, celebrating, and actually intentionally developing something that is pure and holy and good in anticipation of what God has created good in the context of his wisdom, right? That's what we need. We're not going to be able to shelter and avoid it so much, but we can teach it. And as fightthenewdrug.com would say, we must teach our kids about sex, or else pornography will. And literally, those are the two options, it seems like these days, because even in the school system, some of the new teaching strategies, in the health classes, it's pretty pornographic. It just normalizes and just makes accessible just this whole new world of sex that these kids, we wouldn't even teach them these things at their parents. So anyways, I could go on and on and on about this. There's a whole other aspect of it, that I think causes it. Back in ancient, just go back to Bible times, ancient, Hebrew culture, for example. Boys became men at the age of 13. They were able to marry. They were able to make big decisions about just kind of their religious duties. And women hit that place at 12, right? Right at those pubescent times, it went from boy to man, and they started having these man responsibilities. And now, right, we have this word teenager that was created in the early 1900s. It's a new concept, and what it does is it kind of delays that adolescence for an extra, 10 to 15 to however long years, right? And it puts our young people in this world of normalized and accessible sex, but also waiting to be seen as men until they are, marriable and that kind of stuff. So we've got to take some responsibility too, I guess, in just delaying, that waiting period, where even if a young man came across and said, I want to do this right and holy, and I want to wait until marriage, for them, that means waiting an extra 7 or 8 years than anybody did, put previous to like our generation, our society, like previous to the 1900s, 1800s, like people didn't have to wait that long. Probably they just got married, and there was more to it than that. I know, but anyways, there's some wisdom here that we can take to speak into this world. And so, since I've already given a 12-minute introduction, let's talk about the Bible for a bit, okay? Proverbs chapter 5, starting in verse 15. Drink water from your own cistern, water flowing from your own well. Should your springs flow in the streets, streams in the public squares? Okay, so a few notes I want to make on here. Obviously, if you read that in connection with all the previous verses that we've been talking about, water, cistern, wells, springs, these are obviously euphemistic words to talk about just this reserve of sexuality and our nature of sexuality that's been given to us. And that's a big point here. We've all been given a cistern, right, to drink from. We've all been given a well. This is natural. It is God-given, right? Your sexuality, your desire for that connection with people, that's natural and God-given, okay? And so again, we can't live our whole lives sheltering our kids from that and stigmatizing it. We've got to start teaching what God created and meant for good. We got to teach it as something good, at least in the context that He gave it to us. But we all have this in us. It's been given to us. And His encouragement here is to drink from your own cistern. Water from your own well. I think he's referring to marriage there, right? If you have this combined well, this combined cistern, right? This is my wife, and so I can drink from my cistern. I can share that sexuality with her. Should your springs, right? This is more personal. Should your springs flow in the streets, streams in the public squares, right? Our sexuality was not meant to just be scattered around. It was not meant to just go with just kind of the public scene. It was reserved, right, to where we drink from our own in the context of marriage, and we don't just spread it out, right? We take it seriously. Okay, so there's two things here. The first is this. I love the word image of just the cistern or the well, right? Like a pool. There's clean pools and there's dirty pools. And there's dirty pools because we've let just kind of the muck and the mire make its way in. We've cut out the chemicals. We're not taking care of the filter and all that kind of stuff. And so the filter is just, it's useless. There is no filter, and it just gets dirtier and dirtier, right? And that's how a lot of people grow up. They grow up with just this baggage of dirty water that they didn't even realize they were making dirty because there was no filter. So the first part of this, I would say, is understand that God has given us all this, and he has also put it on us to some extent to guard it, to keep it pure, to keep it holy, to filter the junk out, right? So as things come into your life attempting to dirty the well, dirty the water, then what are those biblical spiritual safeguards that you put in place to filter that stuff out, right? When you see that thing on the TV screen, or when you hear that comment from that other person, what is it in your mind that helps you filter that? Is it just a quick prayer, or just a walk away? What is it that helps you filter those things out to not dirty the water? But the second thing is to be very careful about what comes out of your cistern, and when it comes out of your cistern or your well, right? Focus on how it comes in, but also focus on how it goes out. How and when does that happen? Certainly it should happen in the context of marriage, right? That's how it should happen. It was not meant for strangers, and that's the next part. He says in verse 17, they should be for you alone and not for you to share with strangers. Not for you to share with strangers, right? This is hugely important in the context of marriage, but even outside of marriage, right? In the context of sex, really, everybody's a stranger except for your spouse, right? Like, that's pretty much it. Everybody is a stranger except for your spouse when it comes to sex. One of the thoughts here, though, that I just love, it was reaffirmed in me with Matt and Lauren Chandler's book, Mingling of Souls. So one of the best messages I've heard, it's basically a commentary on Song of Solomon, but it's one of the best messages I've heard on just purity and holiness, and how that should build a marriage and help a marriage get off its feet, and just that dating and courtship relationship. And one of the great mysteries that I've always had, really, part of just my childhood and my upbringing, my dating experience, which was basically nothing until I dated my wife, before we got married, is what the need is to go ahead and, the need for people to just immediately call something, a relationship, a dating relationship, or they're together. You know what I mean? What the need is for that, versus having this soft mingling of souls that is based on friendship, companionship, but it's not so emotionally, certainly not so physically tied to one another, and why that friendship cannot become, a marriage relationship, why it needs this long progression of more and more and in more and more intense levels of unity and physical contact and spiritual dependency. You know what I mean? Why does it need to be that? So anyways, that's kind of a random thought and kind of a side thought, but I think it's a good thing to elevate friendship, among a young man and a young woman, to not feel the need for them to just jump into this relationship where they already feel, because they are together, the pressures of what the world would say you need to start doing if you are truly together. Does that make sense? Okay. It goes on to say, verse 18, let your fountain be blessed and take pleasure in the wife of your youth. Okay, there's that well, that your own cistern, right? The fountain. The wife is referred to as the fountain in Song of Solomon a few times as well. Verse 19, a loving deer, a graceful doe, let her breasts always satisfy you, be lost in her love forever. Okay, that's overt, right? The Bible isn't always a PG rated story or narrative. It's not always that way. It's pretty open, and there should be a satisfaction in the physical relationship, in the embracing of each other's bodies. There should be a great satisfaction where he uses the words that you're just lost in her love forever. You're just lost in her love. And I would say in this passage, that's the crux of the whole thing. This idea of being lost, right? Because he repeats it 3 more times. The Hebrew word for being lost there, it's the same as being enraptured or captivated by. You are lost in her love. That same Hebrew word is used in verse 20 and in verse 23. All right, and so we'll kind of talk about the context of those. But the first one is just be lost in her love, right? To be enraptured by this graceful person that is so satisfying to you, and you're so lost in the love with her that you're not even inclined to share your cistern with strangers. You know what I mean? And by the way, it might sound like, I mean, when we're talking about relationships and stuff like that, it's very easy to get to the place where it's just like, hey, you're not being, that graceful doe, or that, I think mountain goat is really the literal thought here, but you're not being so graceful, you know what I mean? So it's going to be hard for me to just commit myself to you fully, right? Love is certainly a verb. Love is a commitment. Love is devotion. And so there are going to be times where your loving wife is not so loving. She doesn't come across as a graceful deer, but more as like a, like a bull with horns. You know what I mean? Based on her day. I mean, that might happen. We all have times, but it's kind of on you at those times to still see the gracefulness that is behind all that. The capacity that she has to be what God calls her to be, and then to help her get to that point. And it's the same for women towards men. Your spouse, we help each other be what God has called us to be. And so, if you're reading this and think, well, geez, my wife isn't graceful at all, you know what I mean? We haven't been physically intimate for 6 months and blah, 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 blah. And so, I'm not lost in her love, and I think I need to find somebody else who I can get lost with. That's... Hopefully you see how that is contrary to the wisdom here. There's got to be effort on your part to help her get to that place. So that's kind of a rambling thought there, but listen, that was the first part of being lost in her love, lost in this wife of your youth, this fountain that you guys have come together, and there is purity, there is connection, there is unity. Contrary to the alternative, which is this: why, my son, would you lose yourself with a forbidden woman or embrace a wayward woman? Right? You have this fountain of blessing in your wife. Get lost in that. Why would you get lost with a forbidden woman, seductive woman, adulterous woman, a promiscuous woman is the idea. Why get distracted? Why get lost with that? Because if you do, man, there's just intense consequences, right? We are to preserve what God has given us, the fountain of blessing that comes from just a pure relationship and all of the sexual benefits that come with it. We are to preserve that even when it's not, necessarily the easiest to come by. It takes work, certainly, but we must preserve that, because if we act impulsively and if we're just drawn to, the seduction of another person, then we run the risk of getting caught and tangled in the alternative, right? Where the main thing that God calls us to do is to invest in that single cistern and to find full satisfaction in that, right? But when we act impulsively against the blessing that comes from that, then we leave ourselves vulnerable, basically to the wolves, right? And it's not a great experience. So be lost in the love of your spouse. Do not be lost in the love of other people who look more satisfying, but truly aren't, because it's not your cistern, right? Dirty water is what it creates. So in verse 20, he says, once again, why, my son, would you lose yourself with a forbidden woman or embrace a wayward woman? And then what I think he says after that is just some helpful tips, right? Why would you do that? And how do you avoid it? We've kind of been talking about it already, but in verse 21, he helps us answer those questions. He says, for a man's ways are before the Lord's eyes, and he considers all of his paths, right? The first reason why we don't want to get caught and lost and captivated by the adulterous woman is because if we have any reverence for the Lord at all, we need to understand he's watching. Okay? He's watching. Everything you do is always in the open. And if you have a reverence for the Lord, then that concept alone is going to be compelling for you to know that there's nothing that you are doing in secret. And in the same way that you wouldn't want your dad or your mom or your brother or your sister, these people who love you, you wouldn't want them to know about your acts in the secret with the adulterous woman or whatever, you know what I mean? Then don't do it, right? This applies to married people. This applies to singles. Remember, everybody who isn't your wife is a stranger when it comes to sex. Everybody who isn't your husband is a stranger when it comes to sex or sexual activity. And God sees all of it. He sees all of it. And if you have a reverence for the Lord, then that should upset you a little bit, right? I remember when I was doing youth ministry, and we had a lot of young women in our youth ministry, these little high schoolers who they didn't have strong father relationships. Or strong relationships with their fathers, and so they would frequently get in and out of relationships with guys who they had nobody to be afraid of. You know what I mean? So it was kind of like my philosophy that, like, if there's a young girl who doesn't have a dad, for her new boyfriend to be afraid of to some extent, then I got to kind of fill that role a little bit, which probably wasn't the smartest thing as a young 20s person who looked more like a brother than a dad. But if she brought him to youth group, it was going to be pretty clear that I was watching out, because I feel like it's a healthy thing for people in a relationship to have at least somebody who loves the other person and that we need to have a reverence for and to understand that there should be a healthy fear there, right? But even all that aside, right, God serves that purpose most of all. That not only does he see everything I'm doing, he's seeing everything she's doing. Not only does he love me and doesn't want me to fall into that stuff, he loves her. And he doesn't want her to fall in that stuff. And so it's going to be better for me to not lead her that way. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's a healthy, good understanding. For a man's ways are before the Lord's eyes, and he considers all his paths. The Lord knows, and he has a sovereign way of making things right. Whether that be through the redemption of his son or just the consequences of actions or both, which is what people find themselves in a lot of times. All right, number 2 is this, verse 22. A wicked man's iniquities will trap him, and he will become tangled in the ropes of his own sin. So another reason to avoid the wayward woman, or really just the world of promiscuity and sexual freedom outside of marriage. Another reason is not only because God's watching, but 2, it's because there is a world of traps and tangles that are ready to snatch you away. I mean, there is a world of traps and tangles as a result of sexual promiscuity with strangers outside of marriage. And we see it in the normalization and accessibility of our sexual culture today. We see it, right? Abortion rates have skyrocketed through the course of the pandemic because people have nothing better to do than just sleep with each other. Not only that, people are losing their jobs. They don't feel like they can afford, another kid, and yet they have this kid, and so abortion rates are skyrocketing. Interesting thought on this. By the way, that's one of the traps and tangles, right? If you have an abortion, you're going to be wrestling with that for a while. I've never heard a story of one person who proudly got an abortion and remained proud about it forever. You know what I mean? Usually it wears on your soul a bit. I also heard one author who was writing about abortion and said, abortion is couched under women's rights. You know what I mean? It's kind of just this big women's rights push. You have the right to do with your body as you please. And he said, it sounds good that way, of course. And he, in his mind thought it's actually more so men's rights to be able to impregnate women and then to escape the responsibilities of being a father to that child. So it's a trap, it's a tangle, it's a mess, and that's just one area. Teenage pregnancy, kids who are having babies without any support system, without any knowledge of what it means to be a parent. It goes on and on. Not to mention the overwhelming sense of shame and guilt that people carry. The brokenness of heart that comes whenever you've aligned your heart physically, sexually, spiritually with one person, and then that's severed, and then you do it again, and then that's severed, and then you do it again, and then that's severed. All of that, right, is what happens. These are the traps and tangles of living in sexual promiscuity outside of the bounds of marriage, within marriage, when it's done correctly, and when there's satisfaction in the physical relationship, and when it's all in the blessing of the Lord, how it's supposed to be. All of that stuff is gone. It doesn't mean that there's not going to be other struggles, you know what I mean, relationship-wise, certainly. You're going to have to fight through some things, but listen, yesterday was my wife's 30th birthday, I asked her to go out with me for the first time 15 years ago. She was 15. And that was when we kind of started our relationship. And so we've been together for 15 years. We dated for 4 years out of that, and then we've been married for the other almost 11 years now. And they always said there's little humps. 7 years was kind of a big hump for new marriages and so on. But man, it's just gotten better and better and better. And it's not because we've been perfect. It's not because we are some kind of like religious, like it's not because we're, these heightened spiritual warriors at all or anything. You guys know us, we're pretty simple people. But one thing that both of us were convicted about from the start is that we wanted that part to be right. You know what I mean? To at least come together in a right way. And for our marriage to mean more than just physical attraction and sexual release, and just it needed to mean more for us. And so our marriage was basically it felt like an ordination service almost. There was worship music. We wanted it to be clear that our marriage was not so much about us, but how God might use us together for his kingdom, for the things we were doing at that time, which was youth group and ministry, and now even more ministry. And I'm telling you, the blessing is real. The satisfaction is real. If you can give yourself to that kind of commitment, which I know is scarier for young people, to give themselves to such a commitment. There is blessing in it, and we can attest to that. But listen, so number one, just know that the Lord's always watching. Number two, there's traps and tangles that we must avoid. Not to mention just sex ed stuff, all the sexual transmitted diseases and all of the risks that come with just unsafe sex and, all of that. The third is this, verse 23, and this is the most important for me, to be honest. He will die because there is no discipline and be lost because of his great stupidity, is what mine says in the CSB. Foolishness is the idea. So you can either be lost in the love of your wife, right? That's what he talks about in verse 19. Verse 20, be lost in the love, enraptured, captivated away from what is good by the adulterous woman. Ultimately, if that's the case, and if you live this way without discipline, without reverence for the Lord in this area, verse 23, he kind of brings it down. He says, well, then there's death, no discipline, and he will be lost. It's the same word, captivated, enraptured, because of his own foolishness, because of his own stupidity. And listen, when it comes down to it, we're using Bible words here, to live in sexual promiscuity, and to disregard God's design for marriage and blessing, to dirty the waters of your sexuality freely without any conviction, to live this way, right? This is where it cuts a little bit. It's stupid, is what the Bible says. Foolish, stupid. You're hurting yourself. You're hurting other people. You're probably going to hurt the next generation. Whatever you produce, there's going to be baggage. There's going to be shame. Listen, Solomon knew this all too well, didn't he? He was, the author of Proverbs, was the product of a relationship between David and Bathsheba, where David inadvertently, indirectly, pretty much killed Bathsheba's husband by sending him to the front lines of battle, and then he took her. Right? He slept with her. He took her as his wife. Solomon was a product of that. Solomon saw it. Solomon gave himself to it later in his life, sadly. He knew the ramifications of it, which is interesting that he still lifts up this idea of having a single wife and to find your blessing in that. It's not easy. The wisest people have fallen to it. But listen, this is what God calls us to do. And it might sound harsh, but if we don't do this, if we don't follow what God has clearly said is the blessed way that will be the best for you and those you love, and we say, okay, I hear that, but I'm still going to do what I want to do to satisfy what I'm immediately feeling now, then that's stupid. It's just stupid. And it's foolish, and it's harmful, and it's hurtful to you, and it's hurtful to the people around you. Okay? And that might sound harsh. And listen, I need to end here with a message of hope, because I understand if the culture is truly how it is, then there's probably people who are in the, in the view of my voice, who have given themselves to this. They've been lost in the things they shouldn't have been lost in. And so, though I'm coming down kind of hard in hopes of helping some people preserve themselves and to cherish marriage and to cherish their sexuality and to do it right as the Lord prescribes, now, I also want to say this, and it's a message I always want you to know, and I hope you know it's from me. It's what I feel, and it's from the Lord. It's the message of redemption. Colossians chapter 1, verses 13 and 14 said, He has rescued us from the domain of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of the Son that He loves. In Him we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. Sure, the world of sexuality, that is a dark domain in our culture, and many of us have or will fall into it. It does not mean that there is not always a ready rescue in the redemption of Jesus Christ. And in Titus chapter 2, verse 14, it says that He gave Himself for us to redeem us from all the lawlessness and to cleanse for Himself a people for His own possession, eager to do good works. And listen, right now, if that redemption is something that you're feeling like you need, you've been living in promiscuity, you don't have a husband, you don't have a wife, but you've been satisfying some of those urges that are natural and even God-given. You've been satisfying them through different, platforms and pornography and one-night stands, relationships, and different things that you've been doing. Or maybe it's just a relationship that you have and it's steady and it feels good, but you've not gotten to the place of the committing to marriage. Listen, today is the right day. There's never a day too late to give yourself to the redemption of the lawlessness that you've been living in and to let the Lord cleanse your heart, right? And set you on an eager path to do good works. Today is a wonderful day to begin that. You know the risks. You know what God says is good, right? So let's do what is good. And if you are harboring, some shame, if you got things in your life as a result of this world of promiscuity that are hampering you down, listen, tonight's the night, right? Give it to Him. Let Him redeem you. There's forgiveness if you confess those things to Him. Make some changes in your life to avoid those kinds of things. Reset the filters so that the pool doesn't get dirty. And then pursue the Lord and be eager to do good works. And listen, He'll give you what you need. If you desire marriage and you're praying about that and you're guarding yourself, I fully believe that God will give that to you. And in the meantime, He'll give you what you need to stand firm. He'll give you what you need. Okay, now be confident in Him. Trust His way, even if you can't see the immediate benefits of it. Trust it, and then trust that He'll give you what you need to get there. All right? And in that, there will be more blessing than you could ever possibly know by satisfying just the impulses of the flesh here and there. So, listen, let's teach our young people about sex, but teach it in a way that is respectable, that is celebratory, that is good with anticipation and filled with the wisdom of God, so that our kids do not look to pornography to learn about it, right? But they would have a foundation about it and something to look forward to, and that they would understand the blessing in waiting. Let's step into that world. It's going to be confusing and tough sometimes, but listen, we'll do it together, and this will be a great thing for the church to continue to talk and have resource options for us parents, especially us young parents, when it comes to raising our kids with a wise perspective of purity, sexuality. I so want that for my family, and I think you probably want that for your family too. So why don't you, in this time, if you are doing a watch party or whatever, why don't you in this time just kind of thinking just about your own battle with just the culture around us, things that maybe have distracted you and raptured you, and you've gotten lost in. And to take that time to confess of those things and to repent of those things before the Lord and let Him redeem you and bring you into an eagerness for good works. Feel free to discuss the culture. I only scraped the surface. So if there's anything else about the culture that has been a particular struggle or just been surprising to you, if you come across statistics or things like that, think about that stuff. If you feel totally disconnected, right? maybe you're 75 years old and you just didn't realize how rampant just the sexual domain of darkness is. Then maybe you need to just have some time with your spouse to just pray, to seek the Lord about how you can be a resource to young kids, understanding the context they're growing up in, and understanding that they didn't choose this. It's just how they're growing up, and how you can stand against the promiscuous age that we live in. How you could be a resource for young people, not to shame them or guilt them into holiness, because that never works, but to be a resource and encouragement to them with some empathy about what they have to deal with. Let's talk about that, pray about that. Love you all. Sorry for the lengthier Bible study this evening, but I hope it was meaningful to you. Certainly meaningful to me. And we'll jump into Proverbs chapter 6 next week, I believe. So love you guys. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks.